Hi there, thanks for watching. My name is Martin Kowarsch. I'm a philosopher by training and I'm heading the MCC's working group on scientific assessments and ethics. We are doing research about how best to design scientific advice for public policy from a societal perspective. For example, we want to know how the IPCC or national expert committees can provide policy-relevant, credible and legitimate assessments on climate policy. Employing philosophical reflection, political science, and deliberative democracy theory, as well as empirical methods, we aim to understand how scientific expertise can really serve democratic policymaking. Particularly, we are interested in the appropriate treatment of values and ethics at the interface between science, policy, and society. Value conflicts at the science-policy interface are also the topic of this short clip. Value conflicts are super relevant for understanding the lack of climate action globally. Controversies in climate policy are not just about facts and uncertainty in climate science, economics, or engineering. Facts as such don't tell us what to do, unless values are implied. Even climate skeptics are actually more concerned about their values than about physics. Disagreement over climate policy in society also goes beyond conflicting interests concerning the distribution of wealth and financial burdens, where often egoism is the guiding principle. Think of a green guy, a libertarian, a leftist person, and a conservative nationalist. Their conflicts are more than just conflicting distributional interest. Different values and worldviews matter here. Values are the most fundamental and stable but often vague and implicit guidance in our lives. Values indirectly affect our norms and beliefs. For simplicity, economic models usually cover only one or a few values. In fact, however, people have many different values, as you can see on this figure from value sociology. This diversity doesn't imply radical relativism. Instead, Schwartz et al. Have identified several universal value categories. They are structured along two major dimensions: self-transcendence versus self-enhancement as one, and conservation versus openness to change as the other value dimension. There are universal values also because values are interconnected and there's a motivational continuum, since the values just reflect human needs on different levels. Different emphasis on these values affects our assessment of climate policy options. Well, philosophical analysis has shown facts and values are intermingled in all of science. There are no facts without theory, and no theory without values, including disputed ethical values. Let me show you what these philosophical thoughts on fact-value entanglement mean in practice. In late 2017, the US Environmental Protection Agency under Trump recalculated the social costs of carbon to $1 to $6 for near-term emissions, in contrast to the $45 calculated under Obama. This new calculation of climate damages would indeed render any ambitious climate policy absurd. The low CO2 price, however, results from a high discount rate, which disregards future generations and focuses on domestic climate damages only. Climate change has often been framed in terms of liberal values, such as global equality and harm avoidance. Conservative values, such as purity, authority, and in-group loyalty, can explain this difference in discount rates and domestic focus. That's why we can't just present facts and don't care about the values. Any attempt to avoid value conflicts at the science policy interface involves the danger of implicit dogmatism. Take the example of disputed temperature targets again, such as the 2-degree goal. Public acceptance surveys hardly ever indicate a policy consensus, and they are just uninformed snapshots. Also insufficient are the simple assumptions in many economic models on utilitarian welfarism. They are overly narrow in terms of their focus on material interests, distributional conflicts, and nudging. Similar problems occur when just providing abstract ethical principles. More promising is perhaps the reframing of climate policy options in terms of conservative values. But this approach is limited to a few policies, and why should Republicans trust in such ad hoc policy claims? This is a rather static approach, not allowing for any learning processes. Therefore, we often hear the humble suggestion to just make values transparent. This is necessary but insufficient. Sets of values are unstable. And what is the impact on polarized debates of just making values transparent? Instead of all these predominant approaches, we propose a more active and constructive treatment of values, namely a collaborative cartography of the implications of policy alternatives. Similar to a hiking guide who ideally does not tell you where to go, but what the respective implications are. The decisive idea is that in their evaluation, policy goals and means are interdependent via the consequences of the means. In other terms, goals which reflect values do not justify the means. For instance, in order to evaluate the 1.5-degree global temperature goal, one should take into account that the required extensive use of biomass for bioenergy production might negatively affect forests, food security, and biodiversity. Consequently, as our approach, we suggest to carefully explore alternative policy pathways in terms of goals and means in light of their practical implications. These alternative pathways should represent major societal values to facilitate learning about the linkages between our values, the goals, and the policies. Stakeholders and the public need to be involved in this process. We don't have to decide which values are better or more important than others, but we have to integrate these values in climate science and climate policy debates. The major effects on politics and policy stem from the deliberation process involved. What is deliberation? It's the exchange of reasons under conditions of fairness and equality, and it's essentially about accommodating alternative views. It's thus a combination of debate, which is about argument, and dialogue, which is essentially about conversation. In contrast to the other rather static approaches to values, deliberation acknowledges that policy preferences need to be formed in social learning processes. The deliberation we have in mind more specifically envisages learning via concrete policy implications. We currently observe an increasing number of deliberative initiatives in many countries. Take, for example, the much discussed Irish citizen assemblies. For the Irish citizen assemblies, a representative sample of people have been gathered to discuss and deliberate about really controversial policy issues such as climate change and climate policy, and the results were taken up by the Irish Parliament. If well designed, for instance, strictly moderated with explicit goals of collaboration and learning, and long enough duration, structured methods of knowledge exchange, etc., deliberation about policy alternatives can have the following impacts. First, it can increase legitimacy and buy-in by being involved and having a say in politics. Second, it can lead to epistemically better policy assessment and better policy options in the end, since diverse values and different kinds of knowledge are better taken into account. And third, it can lead to significantly more policy overlap despite value diversity. This is due to a better understanding of policy problems and options achieved by those involved in this learning process, and due to the creative process of jointly developing new pathways. This inter alia involves growing appreciation of other values as well, in light of perhaps surprising implications of particular policy pathways. And when the links between our values and concrete policy options to realize these values become more visible, then latent values can also become awakened, for example, regarding nature. This may help overcome the often observed gap between our values and our actual behavior. Indeed, such deliberation processes, informed by science and diverse values, can be an essential component of the fight against current populism and increasing social and political divide. Again, for overcoming populism, economic approaches are perhaps necessary but insufficient because they neglect other values and identity issues involved. Deliberation can help in three regards. First, hatred against the elites might be reduced by taking people seriously, by creating ownership and trust through participation. Second, false beliefs become challenged because arguments are required in deliberation processes. And third, the good values underlying some populist claims are made more conscious and transparent, and then recognized and integrated in the policy assessments. Deliberative democracy is not just a theory, but there's meanwhile plenty of empirical evidence that it actually works. Simon Niemeyer reported about a deliberation process in Australia about climate policy that also involved climate skeptics. Surprisingly, some skeptics gave up their climate denial during this process, since for the first time their actual values and needs were recognized, and the need for denying climate change disappeared. We learned that it's not the people who are stupid, but rather our policy processes. Nor are most people uninterested in their world, they simply often do not feel involved. We should therefore support the current initiatives in several countries to establish deliberative participation of citizens in policy processes, and push these initiatives towards science-informed and values-informed learning processes about concrete policy alternatives.